Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Securing the Edge, Visibility, Control, Response. Today we're going to be looking at how malicious insiders and IoT-based attacks continue to grow, bypassing your perimeter security defenses, and learn how to reduce the risks and vulnerabilities to your network. Today's webinar is presented by Aruba and Zunesis. Zunesis is a premier IT solutions provider specializing in enterprise infrastructure, cloud computing, on-premise solutions, networking, security, renewal support, and services. We are an Aruba Gold partner and an HPE Platinum partner. Since 2004, our trusted account managers and solution architects work to deliver complete IT solutions and services to help our clients execute their goals, plans, and objectives. Zunesis services customers throughout the Rocky Mountain region and Southwest, with our focus in the Colorado and Nevada markets. Today, we're joined by Andy De La Cruz. He is a network security CSE from Aruba. So Andy, we'll let you jump right into it.
Thanks. My name is Andy De La Cruz. Like Matt said, I am the network security CSE for the West Coast. I cover the portfolio that we have at Aruba. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ClearPass, which is one of our products that we use for actually securing the edge. So a quick overview of ClearPass. ClearPass in this diagram is basically the idea of, if you look at the left side of users, we look at users whether they are visitors, administrators, employees, even guest users that may be having some kind of guest services that you might provide. But not only looking at users, but we also look at devices. We still treat devices as what we would like to say users, whether they're BYOD, whether they're IoT or headless devices or devices that don't have users attached to them. And how do we get those access to your network, whether they're VPN, wireless, or wired? If you look on the right-hand side of the diagram, you'll see that with ClearPass, it encompasses a lot of different pieces to it. Basically, what we like to look at is we are the gatekeeper of your infrastructure, and basically looking at the whole who, what, and where, and when things should be able to get onto your network and where they should go. By default, we can talk to a lot of identity sources, whether they're LDAP, whether they're SQL, whether they're cloud services. And then we want to be able to collect a lot of context about user information, about device information, health information, where those users are coming from, even the time of day. And with that, we have ability to provide services like guest services, for captive portals. We can act as our own PKI, so if you have certificate services or if you don't, we can work with them, or we can stand alone on our own and provide those services. We can do profiling to understand what those devices are, and then at its heart, we do AAA services, which is basically authentication, authorization, and accounting. So with ClearPass, what is it? It's basically an appliance that can either be VM or a physical hardware. We come in three different sizes. We could basically do a small, medium, or large, depending on how many devices are authenticating. And with that design, we also have licensing that we put on top of that, which would be for access, which is basically just authentication licensing, whether it's guest or if it's going to be like .1x. And then as secondary licensing, that if you want to purchase as an add-on, we also do onboard and then on-guard. Onboard is basically BYOD certificate-based configuration on authentication for devices. So if you think about the reasoning why you want to do certificates is because certificates are your strongest way of authenticating something. And the hard part about authenticating with certificates is getting those certificates on the devices if you're not running some kind of managed infrastructure like Windows. But with BYOD, a lot of times they may not be managed by your infrastructure. So being able to get those certificates on the devices is the reason why you use something like Onboard, so that we can actually have the user configure their devices with a couple steps and get their device connected into your infrastructure with a certificate in some way. Or on-guard, and then on-guard is basically posturing, device health, understanding what's the health of this device, does it have the latest antivirus, does it have a firewall, things like that. So if you want to add a little bit more security features to how your devices are actually the status of the device actually look like, then you could do something like OnGuard to actually enhance that security capability. So when you buy ClearPass, what do you get? So this is kind of an overview of what's kind of built into ClearPass. We don't like the nickel and dime. So the idea behind it is that when you get ClearPass and you get a set of authentication licensing or access licensing, we basically say, okay, our base services and everything here, except for the OnGuard and Onboard, which are the additional licensing, we pretty much just include, whether it's policy, engine, to basically do workflows of how you want those devices or users access to your network, built-in Radius and Radius COA. We by default also do TACACS, so you can replace things like ACS if you have old ACS, things like that. We include profiling because we include it not because necessarily it's a nice to have, because I'll explain later it's a fundamental piece of how we do things, especially understanding the visibility of what's in your infrastructure. We're very agnostic, so we like to we kind of pride ourselves on that. So we have over 100 plus Radius dictionaries to be able to support just about any kind of devices out there, whether they're wired, wireless, or VPN. But we like to pride ourselves that we can support pretty much anything out there. And with each box, it's also got enhanced reporting built into it. So there's no reason to stand up another appliance or anything like that to actually have reporting. We actually have reporting built into it. Also, we have a lot of other tools where we kind of keep things very simplified when you're troubleshooting. So for like access tracking, it's basically looking at how somebody authenticated in the workflow and what policy was assigned to them. We have it in a centralized location to be able to help the admins easily troubleshoot something. And then we kind of try to simplify the ability to create policies by using a template-based model, to where you can kind of just wizard through it depending on what your layout or kind of what kind of infrastructure you actually have. So we can actually try to template it and easy creation and get you kind of going right off the bat. And like I said, we also include guest and also certificate or PKI services. We also do a lot of third-party integration, and that third-party integration is built into the box, no additional licensing. It is part of the appliance. It comes with it when you purchase ClearPass. So here's kind of our 4 pillars of why ClearPass. When we were talking earlier about being able to have visibility, control, and then response, ClearPass is a network access control device, but taken to another level. Like we like to say, it's on steroids. So the main reasons why people will use ClearPass is for visibility, so for device profiling, the reality of what is on your network. A lot of people, especially network engineers, like to think that they have a good understanding of what's on their network, and most of the time they have a pretty good understanding, but the reality is that they don't know exactly or completely everything that's going on their network. So device profiling gives that visibility to those network engineers or even the company to give them a realization of, hey, here are some things that really are connected to your network, and sometimes there's a risk to that, and being able to understand that risk and seeing that, in a report in some way. Like I said, vendor support. We have a lot of support for whether it's wireless, wired, or VPN. We can support whether it's Cisco, Aruba, HP, Juniper. We can support that, and we can do it wired or wirelessly. I like to say layered decisions. We leverage your existing solutions that you may have within your infrastructure. So a lot of times when you look at security is done by layers. We like to say that we can integrate, be that gatekeeper, and then also integrate with all those other layers that you may have in your security, and be able to work with those, and then have some kind of integration to where we can, get more visibility and be that centralized context repository so that we can collect information from your other solutions. But then also when we look at automation for response, how do we do a point-in-time enforcement or some kind of dynamic enforcement when something goes bad? And when we can integrate with things like Palo Alto, we can integrate with like a SIM or Splunk. We can even integrate with ServiceNow if you have a ticketing system, to where we can basically say if something happens or if some of your solutions actually see something that happens, then they can make a call to us, and then we can do some kind of enforcement and change that status. In the past, if you think about it, a lot of times authenticating into the network was all you needed, and that was okay because it was very perimeter based. But now what's happened is that perimeter has pretty much become a piece that is no longer the same because of today's infrastructure with BYOD, and especially cloud services. You know, that perimeter concept has gone away, and now it's kind of expanded a little bit, and it's become more adaptive to your environment. So how do you adapt to that? And then being able to say, okay, if something bad on the inside happens, because now if you think about most of the attacks, it's happening on the inside, not necessarily always from the external in. How do you make that change or dynamically make a change because something bad is happening on the inside? And the other thing is that we do a lot of guest workflows, so that if you, for some reason, have unknown people or you provide some kind of guest services to people, how do you make sure those guests stay on the right segment and they're not getting into your internal network? So here's a little bit of an overview of how we can control things, and we like to call it adaptive policy device ownership. So if you look at this scenario, we have the idea, and if you look at the kind of a little bit of the guts and the pieces of it, you'll see that authentication and even the way that they're accessing, whether they're accessing wirelessly into the same corporate SSID, you can apply different access depending on what, here we're looking at the type of device, a corporate-owned device versus a BYOD device. In the past, you couldn't do that, but now if you think about it today, we could actually say, okay, even though you're connecting to the same SSID, we can give different kind of access and permissions based off who, what, or where you're trying to go. In the past, a lot of people, what would happen was that if they had an SSID or if they had, had a network port, everything was set up specifically for that use. So in the wireless world, a lot of people were creating, okay, if I need a new segment that I need to get devices connected to, like a VLAN or something like that, then they would spin up an SSID attached to that network segment. Now you can do this dynamically. So if you look at this, we can basically say, okay, even though you're connected to the same SSID or plug into the same port, we can dynamically drop you in either to a VLAN, or we can give you some kind of ACL control to say that you're only able to do, A or B. And this kind of describes and or explains the idea of, hey, regardless of how I'm authenticating, whether it's ETLS, which is a certificate, regardless of what SSID or how I'm connecting, I can give you a very granular policy, and then depending on what it is, whether it's user, whether it's device, in this scenario device, I can change that access, and it's not always just tied by whether a user authenticates or doesn't authenticate. So we can get very, very detailed, if you need to, on how you want not only, like I said, users, but also devices connecting to your network. So how do we kind of do some of that extra, control and also visibility and also response? So we do some of that ability is built directly in, but a lot of that also we can get more granular with what we call ClearPass Exchange. ClearPass Exchange is our third-party integration. Like I said, it comes with it. And we are always growing it, but the big part of it is that we like to say that we have a very open framework, and we like to be able to integrate with as much as we can and collect as much information as we can. So like if environments have things like an MDM, like they're using an AirWatch or a Mobile Iron, we can actually talk to AirWatch or Mobile Iron to get status of a managed device, like especially like a smart device, because in most cases you can't put like a computer agent on them. They're going to be managed by some kind of MDM or EMM. So if for some reason the MDM sees that the device has broken some kind of corporate policy, then they can send a message back to us to just take some kind of enforcement action, whether it's a captive portal or it's just not allow them connected to the network at all until they fix it. We can do a lot of multi-factor integration, whether it's Duo or Secure ID. We can integrate with SIMs, so that if like infrastructures have SIMs, and if they have a SIM and they're collecting a lot of logs and they're looking for some kind of alerts or signatures that are going on in their environment, if something is bad, then they can actually send us a message to also take some kind of action, or exchange messages to us, our information to us, so that we can actually index some of that information and apply it either to a user or to a device. We have a very, very tight integration with next-gen firewalls like Palo Alto and Checkpoint. we exchange data back and forth, and because Palo Alto sits at kind of the layer 3 as a gateway to, north-south traffic, it can basically, when it sees some kind of traffic going through their appliances, then they can actually send us a message or send us data about this information that they're seeing from a device perspective or an IP perspective, and then we can actually exchange data back to them, like user information and device information, so that they can kind of correlate some of that and map that information back to some kind of policy. So we have very close integration with a lot of third-party products so that we can get more visibility and be able to get more granular in some of the control, but also adaptive response. So to kind of explain how that comes together, here's a quick overview of how, when we look at some of this information, if you look at like the person Bob, we can always just authenticate Bob specifically, but we want to go beyond that, and we get into what's called authorization. Authentication is always great, but then authorization becomes a big factor too, because authorization, we can get very, very granular on information like what group does Bob belong to based off of the information that you want to collect when you're authenticating him. Like I said earlier, what kind of device are they using? Is it a personal device? Is it a corporate device? Location, so especially if you're working with Aruba wireless infrastructure, we can actually make calls off of location. Where are they actually connecting from the wireless perspective, like it's room 104. We can group APs together and say, okay, where are they actually coming from? And maybe they should get a very specific access. What time of day? And then, like I said, the posture of the device, is it healthy? And then what we can do is we can look into LDAP to validate who they are. If it's a mobile device, we can find out with the EMM and say, okay, what is it, and is it a managed device or an unmanaged device? And then we can do a lot of these post-op updates and authentications, if you see on the right bottom part, where we can then notify our firewall, we can notify our proxy, we can give them, exchange information to them to say, okay, hey, here's some information that we saw, so that we can pass information to them, so they can also, if they need to apply policy based off of the information that we give them. So it's a two-way data exchange. So there's a little animation of kind of how it all comes together. So another way we integrate when we do the response is that a lot of companies integrate or have capabilities, and they implement those capabilities in different ways. So with our ClearPath Exchange, we don't just necessarily say, hey, we integrate in one way. Our preferences, of course, is going to be by APIs, because that always seems to be the easiest and the quickest way. We support REST APIs, but we also support the idea of what's called Ingress Event Engine. What we can do is that we can actually digest syslogs from other third-party products and be able to parse that information and then make a decision off of that information. So like with things like a next-gen firewall, or even the firewalls that maybe don't have APIs, but we can digest a syslog from them, then we can actually take that syslog, parse it out, and then make an action off of it. So this gives us a lot of flexibility, like I said, not that we can only have to integrate with certain products because they only do like APIs or something like that. We can do other ways of integrating with a lot of these other products, because we have multiple ways that we can actually do our third-party integration. So that's why we call it our ClearPath Exchange framework, because the framework actually has multiple ways to actually integrate with a lot of these third parties. And a lot of this is for response, especially the response side of things, where in the security world, syslog is a big factor, and a lot of stuff is done by syslogging, whether it's from network devices, security devices, and things like that. So being able to digest those logs and actually be able to parse them out and take an action is actually a big difference than a lot of the competitors out there. And then what we like to do is, like I was talking earlier, is like we want to really be the centralized repository for context, of all the context, whether it's user context, whether it's device context. We like to be that center of context if we can. And so the idea behind it is that we, part of this whole adaptive trust is being able to share a lot of that metadata back and forth. It's done a lot with, like I said, with Palo Alto and next-gen firewalls. We take a lot of information and then we exchange that back and forth two ways. You know, we send them information because if you think about it, we are at more of a layer 2, if you think about network perspective, a layer 2 concept where we're not going to let a device on the network unless we know who they are. So they won't even get an IP address or anything like that. We can share some of this context back to something like Palo Alto. If you think about it, Palo Alto sits in the layer 3, layer 4. They can see IP information, and then so that because we kind of look at different parts of the network, we can share the data back and forth, and then exchange that so that we have a bigger picture, a better picture, and then also be able to, if you need to, share that information to not only apply policy, but to also do something to where we need to do some kind of response. And because we can do this with third-party integration, none of this requires any agents or any type of software clients that need to be applied. It's completely API-driven or some kind of integration like the ingress event engine kind of integration concept. And one of our last ways that we kind of integrate and we can integrate with third parties is we call a thing called ClearPath extensions. They're basically little microservices that we can like almost like a little app store kind of concept, where if you have certain environments like McAfee, EPO, or if you do a lot of like automated guest registration, like at a front desk and things like that, there's a lot of cloud services that provide some of these like little user interfaces that are kind of streamlined, and we can actually integrate with some of those products to be able to say, okay, if you're running that, we have this little thing called microservices that we can enable that are completely containerized, that allow a quick way to integrate with a product, but yet because we containerize them, they're not dependent necessarily on us upgrading the whole back end of the actual appliance. We can actually turn on services and turn off services within containers, depending on what it is that you have in your infrastructure. So like a big thing for a lot of environments, especially for a reception desk, is using Envoy, where guests can automatically come in, register, sign up, and as part of that process, we can automatically give them internet access in the back end, so that once they've done registered and said, okay, I'm here to see somebody, and they've registered through that workflow, then basically they get internet access in the back end, they get emailed and everything like that, and they don't have to go and re-request it. They basically have gotten that internet access based off of the guest registration process. So I want to kind of give you that was a quick overview of ClearPath, but I want to show you where ClearPath kind of fits into Aruba's concept, what we like to say, the Aruba's 360 Secure Fabric. The idea behind that is basically ClearPath is our, like I said, our gateway or our securing the edge or access environment. We like to say that we're the bouncer, or at least ClearPath is the bouncer that checks for IDs and make sure that people are authorized before they get like into a club or into your network of some sort. That falls into a kind of a whole concept of how we approach security, and this kind of gives us an overview of what we kind of talk about when you hear the concept of Aruba 360 Secure Fabric. Aruba sits at the access layer. We look at things and making sure people authenticate. It works hand in hand with the product that we have called Introspect. And that is basically our UEBA, or User Entity Behavior Analytics product that we have, that looks at in a more passive way. So what the idea behind it is, when I was talking earlier how we do a lot of our third-party integration that you see on the right-hand side, it's about visibility, because ClearPath sits at the layer 2. We authenticate. Once somebody gets on, we're not going to necessarily see what they're going to do, but other products may see that. So we do have our own product that's called Introspect, that falls in the UEBA, which basically is using machine learning to be able to look at some kind of attack or some kind of malicious insider. And then we can actually say, okay, investigate that from an analyst perspective, try to figure out what's going on, and if there's something bad, some kind of bad behavior internally, whether it's malware or just a malicious insider or something like that, then there's an action that can be taken from Introspect to ClearPath to get somebody off the network. Like I said, like whether it's wired, wireless, or even VPN. And with that, we like to also say, okay, from our infrastructure perspective, we have from a ground up with security always built in mind, wireless and then wired products that basically say, hey, from a networking side, whether you're accessing from a wired side or a wireless side, how do you keep that infrastructure secure, even integrating with or without ClearPass? So a lot of these products can stand on their own. They don't necessarily need each other, and so they can actually work independently. But together, there's a little more integration if needed. But like we like to say, we take that approach of being very agnostic to an environment and not try to necessarily lock people into a Aruba-only solution. A little quick overview of Introspect. Like I said, it is basically a visibility tool that uses machine learning. It looks at behavior, not necessarily signatures like IPS is back in the past. So how this fits and helps with our portfolio is that we're looking at basically trusted devices that all of a sudden are acting bad, or maybe a bad actor on the inside or a malicious insider. So the way we kind of do it is a little bit different on some of our competitors out there. We actually take data feeds from both the network side and the log side. So we like to work with a SIM. We don't replace SIMs. We're actually there to work with a SIM, but we can work with a SIM or take the logs directly and analyze those logs as a direct feed. But what we can do is we can look at those logs, analyze those, do machine learning on them, and see if there's anything bad going on. But we can also look at the network side and take in, well, we have a packet processor. You can have our own, or we can use other, work with a packet broker. But we work basically with like a span or a tap or a packet broker, and we digest these packets and do DPI on them, pull them apart and get that metadata, and then look at it and then stitch those two information together from the network side and the log side. We are probably one of the only products that do it from both sides. And most UEBA products, they only do log analysis, and most UBA, which is user behavior analytics, only do network analytics. We actually do both sides, collect it, do forensics, do threat hunting, be able to analyze that data, and then bubble up information that is very interesting based off of behavior, not like I said, not like based off of signatures, because signatures are always going to be a step behind because of zero-day attacks and things like that. But how do you catch based off of behavior? Because an advanced persistent threat is always going to look different than, say, a standard user. So then how do you find that needle in a haystack, bubble that up, and then present it as part of the idea and say, hey, do I need to take some kind of action off for this, and then be able to talk to ClearPass and kick somebody off, or at least quarantine them in some way until you go look at it. We have a lot of different use cases where we can deal with IoTs and users. So the idea behind it is that, hey, an entity can be a user, a host, or an IP address. If for some reason there's not a user tied behind it, how do I, it could be an IoT, and then how do I categorize that IoT? And we analyze all that information, not only in historical baselining, but also peer baselining. So it's a kind of a next-gen solution of being able to get visibility, but then also being able to have some kind of response and being able to close that loop by being able to talk to ClearPass and take some kind of action. So that's my overview of ClearPass and some of the other solutions that we have with Aruba. I thank you for listening, and I really appreciate it, and I will pass it back over to Matt.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that great presentation, Andy. I hope the audience learned a little bit more about how Zunesis can help, reduce the risk and vulnerabilities to their networks. For more information, make sure to go check out Zunesis on the web, and we look forward to speaking with y'all again very soon. Cheers, everyone.